Thank you. So as a linguist, I'm very interested in how young children cope with language that's unfamiliar to them. So motivating a lot of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in this area are some questions and even some concerns about testing. So we live in an increasingly test-obsessed culture, right? And children are taking more and more tests with more and more at stake in their outcomes. So we think that it's increasingly important to understand what really goes into everyone hear me now? What really goes into those outcomes, right? So here's a question. Imagine that you're in second grade. And I choose second grade for a reason, right? Second grade is when it stops being all fun and finger painting and you start to take tests, right? And tests start to matter. So you're taking these tests in second grade, and the tests that you're taking are in a dialect that's different from the one that you speak. So is this something that could affect the outcome of the testing? Is this something that can give us results that don't quite show what you know? Well, when I pose this question, a lot of people will instinctively say, well, no, the differences between dialects are too small. They're just too small to have that kind of effect. But consider this, right? I ask you to go to the kitchen and bring me back a fork, right? Odds are you're not going to bring me a knife or a spoon. But what if I were to ask you to bring me a salad fork? Right? Well, now the task becomes a little different, right? And you might get there, and especially if you don't make a salad fork, dinner fork distinction at your house, you might get a little confused, right? So I think what we learn from this is that sometimes it's not the size of the difference that matters, but what we might call the shape. So what I want to do now is turn to a small dialectal difference that I've come to believe has a shape that's problematic for a lot of kids. All right, I'll see if I can make this pointer work. So in the dialect that linguists typically refer to as African American English, there's no third person singular S. So what do I mean by that? Well, in our standard classroom English, we say, Mary drinks coffee. And Mary drink coffee is somehow ungrammatical. It's odd, it's different. But for a lot of kids at home, what they say is Mary drink coffee, and when they get to school, Mary drinks coffee is the thing that's odd or a little different. So in one of our previous studies, we examined the test results on the Woodcock-Johnson test of applied mathematics, right? Well, this is just your standard word problems test, right? And what we found was kind of astonishing, right? Not only did we find that the more instances of that third-person singular S there were in a test question, the worse a lot of our students did. But our mathematical modeling predicted that for what we called our highly affected group, roughly 15% of the students, the average student would answer 9% more questions correctly if they were just able to handle the effect of that third-person singular S a little better. Right? So that little s was causing a 9% difference. At least we predicted so. Well, linguistics is a science, and like any good science, we want to replicate our results. Right? We want to approach things from different angles and make sure that we're seeing what we see. Right? So in more recent studies, what we did was we actually gave kids math tests that were specially designed. They were linguistically controlled, right? A linguistically controlled test of addition and subtraction word problems. So each child heard the same question, say 2 + 2 = 4, 3 different ways in the same test, right? So they might have heard, at the restaurant, the cook makes chili in the school grammar, but they also heard the sentence, the same question began with the sentence, at the restaurant, the cook makes chili. like their home grammar. And at the restaurant, the cooks, with the plural, make chili, also consistent with their home grammar, but also a part of the school grammar. Okay. So what did we find? The average student that we looked at, these were all dialect speakers, they all had no third-person singular S at home. We found that the average student was 10% less likely to answer questions correctly when they contained that school grammar third-person singular S. Now, we did something else with these kids as well, right? We had them watch a very special cartoon, a cartoon where the characters would come out and they would speak sentences. Some had third-person singular S, some did not, right? But while they were doing that, we had them wear these EEG caps so we could measure their brain waves. We wanted to see exactly what was happening at the millisecond juncture when the third-person singular S was spoken, right? And what did we find? Consistent with what we expected, we found that at that point, we saw what we call a bilateral early anterior central negativity. All right. Okay. What does that mean? We saw their brain light up in a way that signaled confusion, right? That signaled that we're trying to process some piece of language that we don't quite understand. And we can actually see that in this average of the children's brain waves. It's the difference between these red and black lines and the blue and the green. So, back to the initial question, right? Can speaking a different dialect have an effect on these kinds of educational outcomes? I think our answer is yes, right? But what's more interesting, and I think more important, is the set of questions that follow, right? Why? Why does that particular difference, why does third-person singular S cause problems for children in ways that other dialectal differences don't? Those are the kinds of questions that we're particularly interested in answering because we think those are the kinds of questions that will help us to inform teachers in ways that will help dialect-speaking children, not just of African American English, that happens to be the dialect that we're looking at, but when we think about what we've heard already, all the dialects in different languages around the world, we have lots of children who are going to school and hearing things that they might not quite understand. Thank you.
All right, give it up for J. Mike Terry. Some fascinating science going on there. Now it's time for a little bit of Q&A. First question, heads up, coming in.
Thank you. I know we've all heard the term Ebonics and what that entails as it relates to viability for jobs. My question relates to, is this systemic or is it just applicable to the African American or the Black experience? I mean, it seems to be, I don't know, and it kind of infuriates me sometimes when we are trying to make a correlation between certain Black experience in America and how we relate to understanding our environment. Yeah. So how do you reconcile that with your experience, with your study?
Certainly. I think it's really important, right, for us to understand that language has a double nature, right? That language is a social construction in one sense, right? But it's also a formal object, right? We can think about the ways that the structure of a language fits together, right? And so the question that I'm interested in, right, is in what ways do these kinds of structural differences, right, cause potential problems, not because there's anything inherently inferior or superior about one way of speaking, but because they're different, right? And that's very different from the kinds of things that we might ask that I think also have an effect on education. That is, what do I think I know about you because of the way that you speak, right? How do I treat you because of the way you speak, right? And so I think what's very important about the kind of work that we're doing is we're trying to tease those things apart, right? Because I don't think it's enough to address either one or the other, right? I think when we start to ask the question, are there differences because of the structure of a particular dialect, not that it has a problem, but because when it encounters another dialect, right, that children are having difficulties. It's important to locate those and to figure out ways to help children. Now, sort of in response to the first part of your question, this is not specific to African American English. That happens to be the dialect that we're looking at, where we're pulling out this particular little difference. Now notice I pulled out this one little tiny little S, right? There are lots of differences that we looked at that don't matter at all. And part of why we think this is important is we're finding what is it about that particular kind of difference that matters, right? And that may be the same kind of thing that we will see then, that it's actually the same kind of thing we would expect then when we look at other dialects. That kind of difference is what we're trying to find, right?
All right, next question here in the back. First accent of the evening, there we go. All right, we try this again. There we go, awesome.
Hello? Okay, so I was wondering, you mentioned multiple times that the S was a particular difference that was noticeable in your studies, but
yes,
that there were other linguistic differences that were not as noticeable. What are some linguistic differences that you have noticed exist in African American English that have not had any significant effect that you could measure?
Well, if I can just sort of tweak your question just a little bit, right? You said that aren't as noticeable, right? And I think that's what we're finding, right? And what we as linguists expect is not, what is noticeable isn't necessarily what's causing problems, right? So there are lots of things that people will talk about as being characteristic of African American English. Different uses of ways in which the word be is used, for instance. Or oftentimes people will talk about phonological differences, whereas in more standard speech people will say ask and we get ax, right? Now all of those things are things that may have some social difference, right? People think they know something about you because of those differences, right? They may not even notice, for instance, this little thing with this, is there a third person singular S there or not? It's easy to fill in and think you've heard it when it's not really there. We have lots of perceptual experiments that show that, right? But for children, right, that's the kind of difference that matters, right? And we have some ideas about why that might be, right? But it's important to tease those things apart and think about, well, what do people notice in speech? What do people care about? And what are those small things that are actually causing trouble for children? Right? One of the reasons it's important to do this kind of work is because that's what allows us then to actually have very targeted ways of helping children in intervening with these kind of problems. Right? You could spend all day, every day, working on something that, everyone says you should speak this way. But if you can not even change the way the child speaks, so we're not trying to change the way children speak at home. We're not trying to say that there's anything wrong with it. Quite frankly, we wouldn't have third-person singular S in the standard dialect if the printing press had just come along a little bit later in history. Right? It was on its way out of the language, and we just sort of artificially held on to it. Right? Okay. But if we can know that this little difference has the kind of effect that can cause a 10% difference in the way a child is performing on a math test, that's something we can intervene really early in second grade and say, let's make sure that you understand that this is a difference between the way you speak at home and this is the way what happens here at school, and if you can really understand that, then you can go on and do other things.
Some really fascinating stuff here. Give it up for J. Mike Terry.